start quite with the Easter Bunny, because I may not be qualified to tell you if he's real or not. However, I do want to start today to talk with you. You can see my title is a bit of a play on words. What I really want to encourage you to think about today is neuro pathways, which I conveniently left off just to keep it simple on the outset. But I would like to talk to you a little bit about a gentleman named Stuart. Stuart's an interesting fellow. He is a retired attorney, very well-spoken, poised. This is a man who regularly visits at his former law firm to consult on cases. Stuart is kind of what we would consider a steady Eddie. He's a rock. He's the person people go to. He's just unwavering, even keel. But a strange event happens. His wife, ends up hospitalized for pneumonia. And while she's in very good care, I think he probably begins to worry. And she's with the best doctors. And so some weeks later, about 4 weeks later, she's home and she's recovering and all's well. Except that Stuart's son is really, really uncomfortable with Stuart's behavior. Stuart, in the last 4 weeks since his wife's discharge, has become incredibly disengaged with his life. He's stepped out of, well, living. This is a man who, instead of going in for his regular consults at the law firm, he stays home and reads and digs his head into law journals instead. He would go from walks and visit, have social engagements, but all of a sudden he's backed out of these things as well. So his son drags him in to see Dr. Siegel. Dr. Siegel, you can look him up. He's a doctor at UCLA. He wrote a book called Mindsight, where I stole this story from. And Dr. Siegel is, by training, a psychiatrist. But I think if you ask Dr. Siegel, what do? He would call himself an interpersonal neurobiologist. Say that 10 times fast. So Dr. Siegel is brought in, is visiting with Stuart, and really begins to get to know this man. Stuart, strangely enough, agrees to continue seeing Dr. Siegel. And so, of course, as any psychiatrist might do, he begins to ask him questions. Tell me about your life. How did you feel about your wife's hospitalization? Stuart, strangely, says, well, I didn't worry. I mean, she was in the best hands. And then he goes on to think a little bit further. And he goes, yeah, I know it's not right to not have worried, but I really felt nothing. And as far as self-reflection goes, that's where it ended. So then, Dr. Siegel changed the subject. Let's talk instead about your childhood. Tell me about your folks. Tell me about your parents. Your growing up experience. Where'd you go on vacation? Did you play basketball? And Stuart has an incredible ability to tell a story with almost no detail. There's no texture, there's no color, there's no emotion. It's just these bland stories. Everything was fine. His upbringing was common. Nothing unusual. Interestingly, Adrienne, Stuart's wife, is also brought in to make a visit with Dr. Siegel. Adrienne will tell you a totally different story. Well, Stuart's parents were cold. They were odd. They were disengaged, uncaring. Really different story. So as Dr. Siegel begins to explore and understand more about Stuart, he begins to come to an assessment. And the assessment is something like this. It appears that Stuart has an unbelievably strong and well-developed left brain, while his right brain is either disconnected or not functioning or underdeveloped or got stuck somewhere in development, but there's this real disparity between the two. Now, when you think of a left brainer, you're going to think of, well, an attorney, somebody who's logical, highly linguistic, people who love lists, who think in a linear fashion. Those who are right brain are really different. I know you're giggling. Somebody in here is chuckling. The right brainers are going to be seeing things in color, picture. They're going to rely on their gut instinct. These are people who live life in color and metaphor and raw emotion. So you can see where Stuart doesn't quite fit the bill. Dr. Siegel and Stuart continue to have this relationship, and they work together. And Dr. Siegel's plan for Stuart to become, let's say, more brain balanced, if you will, is to take a formula that sounds something like this. The equation might be Dr. Siegel's breadth and depth of clinical experience plus time plus a concept called neuroplasticity. And many of you have already heard about neuroplasticity. This is something that's very in vogue, and we're all talking about it. It's all over the media and in blogs. And neuroplasticity is essentially the ability for the brain to change, to grow. It's a way of saying that the brain is still malleable. And so if you take clinical experience that Dr. Siegel has, and you add time with Stuart, plus this scientific concept, proven, of neuroplasticity, maybe you can give this man a more balanced way of living. And of course, his wife Adrienne begs him to do so. So essentially, what Dr. Siegel does is he starts down a clinical path where his goal then is to work with Stuart to minimize the strength of that powerhouse of the left brain while rising up the strength of the left brain, giving it opportunity to work, to do more of its work. So for example, he gives him a book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And it's just a book to help see, draw, and color in a new way of thinking. He does clinical work where Stuart is going to keep a journal. So Stuart begins to account for things like sensations, where he felt things in his body, memories that start to surface, small things. But as this process goes on, after about 6 months' time, Stuart actually has something really amazing happen. When you start to look at this journal, you see amazing detail, heartfelt stories, metaphor, even poetry, which is interesting because here, what poetry does is it takes the strength of Stuart's left brain and it pushes it over into the right, and that communication left-right is developed, and that strength, that left brain, right brain communication line begins to open up, and he writes poetry even. So what I want to do now is pause for a moment and talk to you a little bit about the basic tenets of neuroscience. So, in a nutshell, a neuron is essentially one of the core building blocks of the nervous system. This would include your brain and your spinal cord, so your central nervous system, and then all the way out into the rest of your body, which we might consider the peripheral nervous system, but some like to call the extended brain, which I think is a neat concept, because the truth is there is some brain, if you will, in your toes. Now, neurons, interestingly, don't exist alone. They put them in a petri dish, one at a time, they die. You put them in sequence, in series, and in community, and they live. So neurons actually do better together, much like people, interestingly. Neurons are use dependent, so if you don't use it, you lose it. If you do use it, it wires to the neighbor. So as a neuron, as a signal, travels from one neuron through that neuron to the next, every time it fires, it wires to the next guy, and the next, and the next, and so on, and thereby developing a stronger neural pathway. So, what I think of neuroplasticity as is simply the opportunity for change. We've all asked somebody in our lives to be something that they're not, to be different. You want somebody to be better at cleaning up after themselves. You want somebody to do your dishes for you. Whatever it may be, you've all asked somebody to be something else. And those of us who've been willing to look in the mirror and be honest with ourselves, we've looked in the mirror and said, ooh, I should probably work on that. So, neuroplasticity is the opportunity for change. So of course, there's a relational impact here, right? If a neuron exists only in sequence, if a neuron exists in community, so too, one brain exists better in community with another. That's why you've come with somebody you know today. That's why you're calling somebody on the way here this morning to check in with a loved one or a friend. We're made to travel together. So the problem with this, of course, is that when we're in community, we affect each other. Now, that may be for the positive, and that may not be for the positive. We may negatively impact each other. So what I'd like, though, to suggest today is that if you strengthen one person within the community, maybe you're the person, then what happens is the whole community is positively changed. I'm curious, has anybody ever been to this restaurant called Snooze? It's a daytime treat. Okay, I love Snooze because you're going to have to go. I'm sorry you haven't been there, but it's on your to-do list. Okay. So at Snooze, there's this very strange thing that's happening. I don't know if I'm the only one. I think it's happened to me more than once. So I think this is something they do. But I'm there, sitting there, waiting to order, and my server comes and sits down next to me and opens the menu and begins to show me her favorite item. And I'm thinking, this is so weird. Why is my server sitting down next to me? And then she does, and then I went back 6 months later, same thing. I'm thinking, this is so interesting. Not the same server, but same kind of treatment. This is one of these stories where the positivity of a person sitting down and looking at the menu just gets you kind of warm and fuzzies. And that can really buoy you. In the same way, we've experienced something maybe less desirable. You've walked in somewhere, you've sat with, at the checkout with a cashier that's super grumpy, and you're thinking, this cashier is so grumpy. Or you go to Home Depot, and you're asking for help, some really random plumbing supply you need, and they're grumpy. It just takes the wind out of your sails. So rather, I'd like to suggest that you have the opportunity to capitalize on your brain's natural design, neuroplasticity, and you can be hope for the future. So what if you're the type? What if you are a better you? Then you come in, and as that tide comes in with you, you raise all the boats. This is what happens when a really healthy neuro pathway affects another person. So this is how Dr. Martin Luther King calls it. I just found this recently. I totally tripped on it by mistake, but I thought it was really perfectly applicable. We're caught in an inescapable network or mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. So, I don't want to bring down things this afternoon, but if you think about the Santa Rosa fires this week, I mean, surely you're disheartened by that, even if you don't have a direct connection. I read a story in the Washington Post about this tragedy in Vegas, and I was moved to tears reading the Washington Post because the story was so personalized about two people. These are, we're affected by other people. We're affected by what they do. We're affected by the world around us, both positively and negatively. So, it's pretty obvious what happens when you have a favorable neural pathway. But what if you have an unfavorable neural pathway? Those are the ones we really need to improve on, right? So, if neurons that fire together are wired together, you get the strengthened neural pathway. And as you strengthen that neural pathway, that repetition, right, is strengthening even more. And as that happens, we run into some obstacles. We can really be challenged by the reality that we face when we're dealing with somebody who has a really difficult neural pathway. You can tell your neighbor, your child, your aunt, you can say, oh, you have an unfavorable neural pathway, you can steal it from me. So, I'd love to hear from you guys a little bit, if you want to take a minute to talk with somebody near you, or think for a minute, or jot down a note, something that may have happened for you, where either you were positively impacted by somebody, or you positively impacted somebody, or in the same way, you negatively impacted somebody, or somebody negatively impacted you. So just take a moment, think on it, share with a neighbor. If there's something you can see where maybe you were stuck, or maybe they were stuck, or you could see where somebody needed to make movement. Think about it just for a moment. So let's talk about a well-paved neural pathway. Let's go metaphorical. Let's go right. So let's say that we have a really, really well-paved neural pathway. Let's say it's 1,000 neurons long. Call it 100, call it 2,000. I don't really care. It's arbitrary. 1,000 neurons long. And we, together here, are making a quick trip over to Germany. We're picking up our stick. By the way, these are my stick figures. I just want full artist, you know. What do you call that?
Copyright.
Yes, thank you. Copyright. This might be right. Okay, so here we are, we're in Germany. We've just picked up our fancy pants. Brand new Mercedes, straight from the factory. Okay? Now, of course, because we're in Germany, we're going to have to drive on the Autobahn. And the road is beautiful, well paved, smooth, sun's out, visibility is perfect, clear. Now, we wouldn't want to go driving on the Autobahn, excuse me, without a full tank of gas. So we're going to fill up and a full tank of gas, new tires. We're going to drive fast because we can. Okay? This is how fast. Think of this metaphorically. This is how a really well-paved neural pathway works. It's fast, no obstacles. Okay? And this is precisely what happens in your brain and in mine every day, and in those around us. Now, those are my names. Okay, now what I'd like to show you, conversely, is an underdeveloped neural pathway. This neural pathway is really short. Now, remember, when neurons fire together, they wire together. But in this case, they haven't fired very often, so it's really bad. I mean, this is bad. So 3 neurons, let's say. Poor, pathetic, 3 neurons. Now, instead of going to Germany, now we're headed up, we're going to Rocky Mountain National Park. And this right here is our bicycle. So you're going to ride your bike. We've just gone up about 3,500 feet in altitude. So I'm thinking the base of Rocky Mountain National Park is about 8,500 feet. So we're going to be oxygen deprived already. We've got our bike, we're in the mountains, and we're getting on a trail in the trees. Now here's the problem. There's a lot of bramble. It's a poor tree, there's rocks, lots of obstacles, okay? Oh man, and it is raining, so now we've got mud. So we're contending with high altitude, a bike, a poor trail, mud, and this bike has a flat tire. This is what it's like for our little 3-neuron neural pathway. This is not a well-paved neural pathway. Now, I submit to you that this neural pathway can turn into into something, maybe it morphs initially into a Honda, which is eventually morphs into the Mercedes, but it can become a Mercedes on the Autobahn if we exercise this neural pathway, because the science of neuroplasticity says when you use it, it will develop. When it fires, it will develop. So if you practice developing that neural pathway, it will get faster. There is hope, even in this. Now think for a moment, let's just go back for a moment to Stuart. When Stuart was asked about his feeling about Adrian's hospitalization, how did you feel about your wife having a really serious case of pneumonia? He said, I felt nothing. 3 neurons. But later, as he develops these neural pathways and really strengthens some of his right brain activity, later he begins to talk about life in color. He has dreams. He talks about sensation. He begins to tell heartfelt stories. So his neural pathways began to develop. Now, somebody wanted to talk about memory. Thank you for bridging that. Was that you? Yeah, thank you. So what I'd like first, though, to do, now I'm going to switch gears on you, but it's going to all come around for you in a minute, so go with me. So first I'd like to talk with you about explicit memory. Explicit memory is essentially the memory that you think of. It's a conscious recollection of an event. So for example, does anybody remember where you were on 9/11? You took a moment, you took your mind there, and you said, yes, I know where I was. Can you tell me where you were sitting, where you were standing, who you were with? That is what we would call explicit memory. You can put your mind to it and go there. It's often autobiographical. You can tell the story. It has timestamps. I mean, my mom continues to tell me the day that JFK was shot. Now, I wasn't born yet at that time, but she remembers it clear as day. So there's autobiographical moments where we can put timestamps. You know, when Michael Jackson's video of, Thriller came out. I mean, like, I remember that. And I can go back and I say, okay, I was somewhere in elementary school, and I can give it about a timestamp, right? So there's an awareness that there's a passage of time. Now, interestingly, explicit memory comes on around 18 months, 24 months. So when a small child, this is why you don't remember being 12 months old. Because you don't have the ability to go back there and recall that information because it hadn't yet developed. Explicit memory hadn't come online. Okay? So I'd like to transition then to implicit memory. This is where we can get into a little bit more trouble. Because this is where unconscious learning and recall happens. So, quick show of hands. Did anybody literally drive a car here today? Did you drive a car? Anybody drive? Okay. Of those of you who drove, do you recall telling yourself to put the keys in the ignition? Nobody? You didn't say, gee whiz, I'm in my car, and you can't recall, because your explicit memory already fell off. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry about that. That wasn't supposed to be a part of that example. You totally ruined my whole talk. So when you sit down in your car, you put your keys in the ignition, it's automated. Some of you, when you got in the car today, even if you weren't driving, most of us put a seatbelt on without even thinking about it. That's implicitly stored learning and recall. Your brain just knows how to do it. It's like walking. It's like riding a bike, as they say. So implicit memory is stored in lower regions of the brain. When you need to pay attention to think about where you were on 9/11, that's already brought you to the forefront of your brain. You've moved forward to say, I'm going to think about what I'm thinking about. Okay, I'm thinking about 9/11. Okay, where was I? That's already brought you to higher regions of the brain. Whereas implicit memory tends to be stored in lower regions of the brain. responses happen. I was just told recently that there's this totally new thing for junior hires where they go around saying, that just triggered me. They have this lingo that they know that something triggered them. It's almost like their language, they have a recognition that something's bothering them. Maybe they can't put their finger on it, but something just bothered them. It's interesting because in implicit memory, it sneaks up on us without us knowing. And the problem is, this is where we begin to box with shadows. This is the stuff that we really, really labor with. And it can be helped. Now, implicit memory develops in the 3rd trimester. So while a baby's in utero, they are already learning. So here's the contrast. If you have a mama who's pregnant, she's thrilled, she's excited, she's anticipating the arrival of this baby. This is like good, happy soup this baby is marinated in, right? Take another mama. This mama also very thrilled about her pregnancy, really thrilled for the arrival of her child, but is in a traumatic car accident during her pregnancy. It's a different sort of soup that baby is marinating in. And implicitly, it will affect that child. Maybe not so profoundly, but it still has the ability to affect a child. The other interesting thing about implicit memory is that it lacks a timestamp. So you might have a sense, a feeling about something. You might have an inkling, but you can't really get to the core of it. That's probably something that's stored implicitly. So let me take you on a little journey. Now, here I'd like to show you a solidly established neural pathway. This is my daughter Margot. She was 3.5 at the time, the big girl. And this baby is my daughter Skylar. She was about 7 days old, 6 or 7 days old in this video. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to play it for you. It's a little difficult to hear. Do your best. I'll narrate it and then I'll play it for you again so you can get the full scope of what is happening.
I think it's not good for you.
Okay. You know what, maybe we need to burp her. Maybe she wants a snack. Maybe she wants to go downstairs and get a snack, you know. So? That's working.
I love this video. I keep coming back to it, and I have 1,000 stories to tell around this video. But the story I'll stick to today is that initially Margot thought that I was taking a still shot because I was taking it with this really old-fashioned thing called a camera. Of course, that camera had the ability to take video. So she didn't know that. So she was expecting a still shot. Now, I also happen to have followed a philosophy. When I was a mom, young mom, with Margot, there's a gentleman also from UCLA named Harvey Karp, doctor. And Harvey Karp wrote a book called The Happiest Baby on the Block. Has anybody heard of this? I don't even know when it was written. You've heard of it? Well, as any mom would want, the happiest baby of the block, I ran down and picked it up with the intent of having the happiest baby on the block. And so, here's in a nutshell what Dr. Karp talks about. He thinks that babies are in utero not long enough, and they need more time that would be in utero-like experiences. So what he wants to do is emulate that in utero experience for the baby once they're born. So the uterine artery shooting by that baby sounds a little like shh, 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 shh. Now we all know why we always do that. The next, he has 5 S's. One of them is the shushing. The second one is swaddling. Small infants have this really weird thing called a Moro Reflex, and their arms like jump out and their legs jump out. And so the Moro Reflex is upsetting because that physical body is doing all these crazy things. So that's why we swaddle our babies, okay? And the third one that Margot happens to have picked up on is swaying. So she starts to rock in the chair. Now, the reason I'm showing you this video is because what I think is happening here is what I call implicit recall. Margot, when she was a very small infant, before she had any explicit memory online, remember, at 18 months, explicit memory turns on. Well-ish, you know. So, in her case, when she was a small infant, I followed the 5 S's of Dr. Park. I happened to shush, I happened to sway, and I happened to swaddle her. Now, with no prompting. Now, some might argue that I told her what to do. You can see in the video, I am throwing out suggestions right, left, up, down, and sideways, and she is paying no attention to me. So, the first thing she says is, this is not a good time for a picture. Obviously, I have a fussy baby on my hands. Back up. Have you ever? I mean, you know? So, all right, it's not a good time for a picture. So then she starts the S's. Now, if you notice, her hand initially is doing a swaddle like on the baby's, on Skylar's hands, holding her hands down. When her legs pop out, Margot goes to grab the legs. Now, her arm was about this, I mean, how you know. But she attempts to swaddle her and keep her tight, right? She shushes, and eventually she sways. Now, the last thing, which is a totally different talk, is the reward this child experiences when she is able to calm down this fussy baby. It's just priceless. So watch it again. This is, think about this, implicitly stored. Nobody's coached her to do this. She knew organically.
I think it's not good for you.
Okay. You know what, maybe we need to break her. Maybe she wants a snack. Maybe she wants to go downstairs and get a snack with you. Think so? That's working.
Now's a good time.
Now's a good time for a picture. These two are 11 and 6 now. I don't know if it's nearly as sweet today as it was then, but anyway. So you can see a little bit about how explicit memory might come up. Now in this case, thank you. In this case, think about how fast that Mercedes traveled down Audubon. This kid, in like less than 30 seconds, rolled out 3 mechanisms to calm this baby with no adult prompting. That is a fast Mercedes on the Audubon. That neural pathway was well paved. Also happened to be stored implicitly. So, the real question you guys are going to ask me is, so what? How do we do this? How do we develop stronger neural pathways? So, we do this in 3 major ways. Mindfulness is essential, and this is also totally in vogue. You can go get an app. You can look it up online. You can, find a blog that talks. I just got an article for my husband's exercise app about athletes and their mindfulness. So there's mindfulness everywhere. But essentially, it's a focused activity. Could be 10 minutes a day. For me, it started out with, well, this is Moose and this is Grace. These are my dogs. And I started petting them. And I'd sit down on the floor and I would just pet them. Now, there's a ton of data on how having a pet is, good for your emotions, essentially. It helps with anxiety, these sorts of things. But I wasn't doing it for that reason. I was just petting them because they were my dogs and I love them, right? But what I realized is I was starting to have a very, very focused time. And what I realized is this was my mindful time each day. So then I made a conscious decision to do this regularly, where I sit on the floor and I just love on my dogs, okay? Your mindfulness could be something entirely different. You could be on a hike and catch a beautiful vista and stop and just go, wow. and focus on that beauty. You can think of a most amazing restaurant you went to in Paris. Oh, do you remember that? The smell and the crepes on the street. And you can go there in your mind and you can focus. You can focus on a word. You can focus on your breathing. There's 1,000 ways to be mindful. I recommend to you, start small, 5 minutes twice a day. That's 100% improvement for most of us. Novel learning experiences. I met this fascinating gentleman recently. His name is George. He's a shoe salesman. And George actually, I think that the thing that most defines him is that he was special ops for the Navy and had spent 180 days in Afghanistan. I asked him about his experience, and he had the most fascinating way of describing how he's living, having seen terrible atrocities. He said, I saw terrible destruction, so I create. It really brings me, like, it chokes me up just hearing this man's story. So he said, one day I was on the internet, on YouTube, and I saw this old fellow from Italy teaching how to make a tie in 6 minutes. He said, do you know the difference between a $400 Italian tie and one you can buy for 20 bucks? And I said, I have no idea anything about ties at all. And he said, the no-run folds. And he said, I saw this video from this Italian guy who was making these $400 ties, and he said, I thought, well, I should try that. If this guy can make a $400 tie in 6 minutes, surely I can make one in 2 days. And he said, I tried it, it didn't work, I tried a different material, it started working better. I've been doing it for years now. This is a man who's really moved into the idea of trying novel learning experiences. It happened to be ties. But for you, it could be something else. A lot of people say, oh, learn an instrument. For me, my daughter started showing one of the dogs in junior showmanship. There is a whole world out there about showing dogs that is completely new to me. And every time I go, every week, and I feel like I get a new PhD because it's so complex. And no, it doesn't look complex, but it is complex. So it's a novel learning experience for me. And of course, aerobic exercise. You know it, you may do it, you may not do it. The great thing about aerobic exercise, like novel learning experiences and like mindfulness, is pick your poison. You can choose any kind. You can do daily burn at home on Hulu for $15.95 a month. You can take a walk around the block. You can take your dog for a walk. You can do yoga. There's a bazillion ways. So the problem is doing it, right? Finding the discipline to do it in small doses. I'd like to also give you a couple of other just tasks for the road, some ideas, some things to think about. One of the things we maybe don't do well is take the time to think about what you're thinking about. For some of you, you guys already know it. Like in 20 seconds flat, you'd be like, yeah, I know what is most present on my mind. Some of you might take 30 days to figure out what is the thing that you most commonly think about. Sometimes it happens to link to worry. Or what's the most recurring feeling you feel? When I first asked myself this question, loneliness came up. And I was like, that is crazy. Why would I commonly feel lonely? I have a very rich life. I've got more kids and dogs and a husband, and there's nothing lonely about my household. I have friends, I have rich relationships, I have a lot of wonderful things going on in my life. Why would I ever feel lonely? It's not because I feel lonely exactly in the moment, it's because actually that loneliness is linked to an implicit memory from when I was a child, where I felt alone because nobody saw me. And so think about what you're thinking about. Think about the feeling. Name the feeling that recurs most. And as you do this, you'll begin to unpeel layers. Because we're a little bit short on time, there's lots of things you can do. You can develop your emotional literacy by learning to name the emotions you feel. And once you do that, you begin to empathize with others, because you cannot empathize with somebody else unless you felt that feeling yourself. I only know jealousy in somebody else because I felt it in myself. I can only read it in somebody else if I felt it myself. So know your emotion. There's a range. There's even this thing, you can look it up, it's called the feeling wheel. And it teaches you so much about the complexity of emotion. But learn to name them. Learn to parse out sadness. There's lots of different parts of sadness. What is that? And so that's one thing you can do. Empathize with others, validate others. As you do that, there's this really rich dialogue that happens. Remember, one neuron doesn't exist alone. It wants community. So too, we as humans want that connection and that community. This happens to be a picture, this is me and my brother and my dog when I was a kid. My mom just happened to text this to me earlier this week, and I love this picture. I think it's my most favorite picture from my childhood. And it brings up a well of emotion, and I can't tell you why. Maybe it's stored implicitly, I don't know. The thing about pictures is you can tell stories, and it's a beautiful way for you to connect. You can connect with your kids, your grandkids, your neighbors, your friends. Stories can be so beautifully told just by pulling out an old picture. So I'd like to bring you back to Stuart. Does anybody have, I think there are two major questions out here about Stuart. Two major questions. Go ahead.
Did he develop his other side?
Did he develop the right side of his brain? He was starting to, right? Any other questions?
Tell us about the Easter
The
Bunny.
Easter Bunny. The Easter Bunny's above my pay grade. Does anybody wonder how old Stuart was? When Stuart was first brought in to see Dr. Siegel, he was 92 years old. Isn't that amazing? So 9 months into his therapy, I should track back. Why did he retreat? Why did he drop out of life? About those weeks after his wife's hospitalization. This is a pressing question, whether you have it or not. Okay.
Because he was afraid.
Fear of loss. Okay. Fear of loss. Why was he afraid? Why was he afraid of loss?
He didn't want to be alone.
He didn't want to be alone, but here's what he had learned as a child. It's not a place, the world is not a place where you should need someone. And if he had, as a child, needed his mom and dad to love on him and care for him and be together with him, he was going to be left out in the cold because his parents weren't accessible. And so he didn't want to need Adrienne, but guess what? He did. He needed her, and he came into this collision in his own experience. And he began to retreat as a way of coping. He dropped out of life to cope. So, 9 months after his time started with Dr. Siegel, Dr. Siegel gets a call from Adrienne, his wife. She wonders if Stuart had a brain transplant. He didn't have a brain transplant. But she did say one other thing. This has been the happiest time of our lives. They had been married for 62 years. Can you imagine waiting 62 years for the happiest time of your life? It's possible. At 94 years old, Stuart was almost 94, he writes a note to Dr. Siegel. This is where I'm going to end. This is what the note said, handwritten, 94 years old. I cannot tell you how much fun I'm having. Life has all new meaning. Thank you. So what I'd like to ask you, one closing question to leave you with, and I'm available here, by the way, to answer more questions. How does the science of neuroplasticity give you hope? What do you hope for? Because I submit to you that because your brain's natural design allows for change and is malleable, that there's hope for all of us. So thank you so much.